the Jet Setting Wealth Advisory Podcast, where your financial journey takes flight with David T.U. As an airline pilot and financial expert, David merges the aviation industry and wealth management to help you navigate today's complex financial skies. Each episode features expert insight, blending personal stories with essential financial strategies. We ask that you fasten your seatbelts and sit back as we prepare for takeoff. Our destination, your financial empowerment.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jet Setting Wealth Advisory Podcast. I'm your host, David T.U., and today we are absolutely thrilled to feature an extraordinary guest, the Honorable David M. Walker, a true titan in the world of finance and public accountability. Mr. Walker is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in the fiscally responsible government transformation and accountability, human capital, and retirement security. He has over 40 years of executive level experience in the public, private, and the nonprofit sector, including heading 3 federal agencies, 2 nonprofits, a global service line for Arthur Andersen, and serving as the Comptroller General of the United States and the CEO of the U.S. Government Accountability Office for almost 10 years. Mr. Walker has been appointed as the Comptroller General from 3 presidential appointments by 3 different presidents, namely Ronald Reagan, George Bush the Sr., and Bill Clinton, during his 16 years of full-time federal service. The U.S. Senate confirmed him unanimously for all 3 presidential appointments. He's previously has had presidential appointments where he has served as the Assistant Secretary of Labor for the current Employee Benefit Security Administration and as one of the 2 public trustees for Social Security and Medicare. Mr. Walker also has served as the Acting Executive Director, Deputy Executive Director, and for the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, also known as PBGC. Most recently, Mr. Walker was the Distinguished Visiting Professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he taught the economics of national security. Currently, Mr. Walker is a writer, speaker, and media commentator. He has authored 4 books, the latest one titled America in 2040, Still a Superpower? Published in 2024. His prior book was entitled Come Back America, and another, Turning the Country Around and Restoring Fiscal Responsibility, which has achieved national bestseller status. He has been featured in a number of major programs and documentaries, including 60 Minutes and the critically acclaimed documentary IOUSA. Mr. Walker, who is a CPA at heart, is also an inductee into the Accounting Hall of Fame, Internal Audit Hall of Fame, National Academy of Public Administration, and the National Academy of Social Insurance. As the founder of Come Back America initiative, he has been at the forefront of driving conversations around sustainable budgeting and empowering individuals to make informed financial decisions. This is only the short version of Mr. David Walker's distinguished accolades. It is certainly not all-inclusive. Today, we'll explore his remarkable career, his vision for financial stability, and on both the national and personal level, and actionable strategies for building long-term wealth in an uncertain economic landscape. Thank you, Mr. Walker, for joining us today.
All that introduction.
Yes.
Time left. Go ahead.
Yes, I know it's long-winded, but I thought that it's important for people to know your background. For more information about you, they certainly can go to Google and read up on your stuff. So let's get started. Mr. Walker, you've had an extraordinary career spanning in the public, private, and the nonprofit sector. Can you tell us how your journey led to you to the current where you are now and the current focus on fiscal responsibility and government transformation, please?
Well, in college, I was an accounting major. And the reason I was an accounting major is because accounting is how you can keep score, and how you keep score matters, whether you're in business, whether you're in government, whether you're in sports, it doesn't make any difference. How you keep score matters. Secondly, if you're good at it, you can always get a job. There's never a problem. So I ended up going into public accounting with one of the major firms, Price Waterhouse. Was an audit and then practice management, running the firm as a business. I then went into human capital consulting, recruiting, search, et cetera. Then I ran my first of three federal agencies, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation and the Employee Benefit Security Administration. That they're both dealing with pensions, but Employee Benefit Security also dealt with health and other employee benefits. Then I went back into public accounting and became a direct admission partner with Arthur Andersen, ran a worldwide line of business for them dealing with human capital strategy. During that time, I was also appointed a trustee for Social Security and Medicare part-time. So full-time Anderson, part-time Social Security and Medicare trustee. And then Bill Clinton appointed me as Comptroller General of the United States, which in English is Auditor General, de facto Chief Performance and Accountability Officer of the U.S. and CEO of the Government Accountability Office. Ran a couple of not-for-profits after that. Was a senior strategic advisor for PricewaterhouseCoopers Public Sector, now Guidehouse, a professor at the Naval Academy. And I'm still very active. I mean, I'm not working for anybody else anymore. I mean, I give speaking, writing, commentary, if you will. I'm on the Defense Business Board. I'm chairman of the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation and involved in a number of other organizations. Bottom line is that I've had some opportunities that I was able to capitalize on. I think I've demonstrated that I have strong leadership abilities, the ability to make major change happen in organizations, whether they're in the public, private, or not-for-profit sector. I've always wanted to give some time to my country and to my community, and I planned to be a career military officer. Had appointments to the military academies, but couldn't go because I have a bad left ear. It kept me out of the academies. Later on, became a professor at the Naval Academy. And so when I first went into government, because I did want to, do some public service at some point, I thought I'd be in for about 2 years, which is about the average. I ended up staying in 6 to 7 years, running 2 federal agencies, then went back in. I'll never be rich because I've spent between full and part-time over half my life giving public service, but I think I've made a difference and I'm comfortable. And now it's a matter of what else can I do to help try to create a better future for our country, for my family, and for future generations of Americans. So that's a lot of info in a short period of time, but I
Absolutely.
think I covered what you wanted me to.
Absolutely. And we want to thank you for your service. Thank you for all the contributions that you made to this country that we currently live in and we can continue to live in. Let's go to this question next, which is, you served as the Comptroller General of the United States for nearly a decade. What was the most challenging aspect of overseeing the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and what accomplishments are you most proud of over that time period?
Well, first, when I came into the Government Accountability Office, the Congress was not happy with the agency. It downsized the agency 40% involuntarily in the 5 years before I was there. What the staff didn't know that I knew is they were going to be downsized at least another 25, maybe as much as 40% if I didn't turn the place around. And so I came in and made major transformational changes. We had been in business since 1921. We never had a strategic plan. We developed a strategic plan. We restructured the agency, eliminated a third of the offices, eliminated a layer of management, consolidated 35 units into 13, leveraged technology, changed human capital practices, changed performance metrics. And the bottom line is that at the end of my term, we were about 15% smaller, 50 to 100% more productive, and 3 times the outcome-based results. We generated for the American taxpayers $110 for every dollar invested in us. We were also reviewed as the second best place to work in the federal government. So the transforming of the agency was a major challenge. I mean, what we did there is transferable and scalable to other parts of government. And hopefully the new DOGE initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency, which ironically is not a department, it's not even in government, but that's a different story. Hopefully they will end up learning some of the lessons and capitalizing on some of the experiences that we had at GAO, because it's the only agency that I know of that has been fundamentally transformed and reduced in size in the last 25 plus years. I had 3 objectives when I became Comptroller General. One, I wanted to transform the GAO to make it a world-class professional services organization that just happened to be a wholly owned subsidiary of the U.S. government that led by example, practiced what it preached, and was viewed as the best in the world with regard to oversight, insight, and foresight. I think we accomplished that. Secondly, I wanted to also help to transform the accountability committee, meaning federal, state, local auditors and auditor generals around the world. I happen to be head of strategic planning for the international organization and on the board for the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions. I helped to lead putting together their first ever strategic plan and refocusing on what they did and how they did it. I think we accomplished that. The third objective that I had that I ultimately was convinced that I couldn't accomplish as Comptroller General of the United States was to try to get the Congress and the president to work together to make a down payment on our large, growing structural fiscal challenge. At GAO, you can be very aggressive about making recommendations on economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, and believe me, we did, okay? But you're really not allowed to make recommendations on policy, that whether that's tax policy or social insurance policy or defense policy. You know, my view is you can't just talk about that you have a problem. You have to end up showing a way forward, not only as to what do you need to do, but very importantly with government is how do you get it done? Okay. You know, whether it's through executive action, through legislative action, through constitutional amendment, whatever it might be. And so when I was convinced that I couldn't accomplish that objective, Pete Peterson, may God rest his soul, former Secretary of Commerce, one of the founders of Blackstone, recruited me to be CEO of his foundation, where its primary purpose was to help raise awareness and educate the public on this issue. And so I did that. And, you know, I've continued the fight. Bottom line is I've been fighting for fiscal responsibility and government transformation for 30 years from different positions on the battlefield, sometimes inside the government, sometimes outside of government, as I am now. And I plan to continue to until we actually make some real progress. And I'm hoping that we will during this administration, but we'll see.
Okay. So obviously in this conversation here, you've advocated for significant reform in the federal spending and efficiency. Can you share your thoughts on how we can address the ongoing challenges with the government waste, especially in light of our current growing debt and fiscal pressure that we're in?
Well, first, I think it's important to understand that, in my opinion, the government's grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget, undercut states' rights, and has not managed to achieve outcome-based results. For example, I talked to you about the fact that, you know, GAO had been in existence since 1921. When I came in 1998, and had never had a strategic plan. We developed one. We made major changes based on that. The federal government has been in existence since 1789. It still does not have a strategic plan. It does not have a consolidated, future-focused, outcome-based, resource-constrained plan. It does not have key national indicators on how do we measure success with regard to the economy, with regard to diplomacy, with regard to national security, with regard to domestic tranquility. We don't have that. So as a result, we're flying blind in mountains of debt without an instrument panel. And so one of the things that we have to do is that we have to implement those things, which will enable us to facilitate a major transformation on what government does, how it does it, how it measures success, determine what ought to be done at the federal, state, and local. What are things that, frankly, the government shouldn't even be involved with that ought to be done by the private sector or the not-for-profit sector? And, you know, and so DOGE, which is the new announcement, you know, by you know, the new administration, the Trump administration.
Yeah.
I mean, it can help deal with the organization and operations of government. You know, that's like economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. But it's not in a position to deal with how do you reform tax policy? How do you reform social insurance programs? How do you reform defense and other spending where it requires legislation and where, you know, there are much more difficult policy choices that have to make. There's lots of room for economy, efficiency, and effectiveness through organization operations. That's what they'll focus on. But we're going to have more initiatives to be able to deal with the other. And we're also ultimately going to have some constitutional amendments to be able to restore a representative republic and keep the Congress from mortgaging our future not just for the country, but for our families and future generations.
So we'll talk about the Department of Government Efficiency here a little bit. In fact, I got a couple of articles to get your opinion on.
Sure.
But let's talk about this. In your opinion, what are the key areas within the federal government that are ripe for transformation, and how can we streamline these areas without compromising essential services?
Well, first, I think you have to go back to the Constitution. I mean, the federal government was created by the states, not the other way around.
Okay.
Federal government was only supposed to be doing things that otherwise couldn't be done by the states or the people, right?
Sure.
And if you look since 1913, which is when the income tax came in, when the Federal Reserve was created, and when senators became directly elected, the federal government's gone from 2.5% of the economy to approaching 25% and growing.
Wow.
In addition to that, the federal government's gone from controlling 97% of spending every year to less than 30 and declining.
Okay.
All right. And so first thing you have to do is you have to look at what did the founders intend for the federal government to do? Because we've strayed way from that.
Okay.
And then we need to go back and connect that to what is it doing right now. We have way too many departments and agencies. We don't have metrics on what they're trying to do. There's a lot of duplication. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of redundancy. And even with that, there are gaps. For example, healthcare. You know, a real major challenge that we have is how are we going to get control of healthcare costs? We spend way more than any other nation per capita.
Absolutely.
Below average results. So what are we doing? How are we going to control healthcare costs? On the other hand, through the tax system, we're giving hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies every year because nobody pays income taxes or payroll taxes on employer-provided and paid health care, which means that they don't have the right incentives, transparency, and accountability. So that's fueling healthcare costs. On the other hand, we're trying to control healthcare costs. So look, I think the other thing we have to think about is we need to be thinking about what are some areas where we need to take a more strategic and integrated approach where we can reduce the number of departments and agencies, consolidate things together to be able to make more integrated decision-making and get economies of scale. I'll give you one example. Human capital. Arguably, our people are our most valuable asset.
Absolutely.
And yet, we've got some real challenges. I mean, why don't we think about combining the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, and our immigration policy so we can look at human capital more holistically? We can look at, well, what should our immigration laws be? We do need immigration. It needs to be legal immigration because we only have 1.62 birth rate for women, which means we have a declining population without immigration. So we need immigration, but it needs to be intelligent. It needs to be legal. What about our education system? You know, we spend a lot more money per pupil K through 12 and we get below average results. Okay. You know, what about a labor policy? Okay. So being able to say, let's take an area and how can we end up figuring out what are we trying to do? How do we measure success? How can we consolidate a lot of things where they're focused on this critical area, but we're trying to work with all these different tools to accomplish objectives rather than having different departments doing their own thing, and in many cases working at cross purposes, but also with a lot more overhead than otherwise you would need. You can make the same, argument with regard to other areas of government, like in EPA, Interior. You can make the same argument in that. So I'm for, let's try to deal with fraud, waste, abuse, but let's take a more systematic review of what government is doing, how government is doing, how do you measure success, so we don't just deal with, well, we're spending too much money for toilet seats, hammers, or whatever it is. I mean, we don't want to do that, but I mean, that's peanuts compared to the $2 trillion gap that we have between our annual revenues and our expenses each year right now and growing.
Gotcha. So how do you think the private sector and innovation can help drive more efficient government practices? Are there any specific examples where you see public-private partnerships to be able to make a significant impact on government efficiency?
Well, there are a lot of public-private partnerships that already exist. NASA is an example. NASA has a lot of public-private partnerships with regard to their mission. In fact, NASA has a lot more contractors working for it than it does federal government employees. The Defense Department, it's got public-private partnerships because it doesn't make weapon systems, right? I mean, that's all done by the private sector, not the government. Are there more opportunities for public-private partnerships? Yes, but you also have to keep in mind that there are certain things that are inherently governmental that need to be done by government people who are committed to the public interest and who have much higher standards with regard to legal, ethical requirements. Government can learn from the private sector, no question about that, but government is not a business. There are many business principles that could apply to the government, but government doesn't measure success the same way as the private sector. The private sector is market share, its bottom line, its stock price. Many of the things can be measured in quantitative terms. You want to do that as much as you can in government, but certain things you can't measure in quantitative terms. Security, privacy, and those types of issues you really can't measure in quantitative terms.
Okay. So since you brought up NASA, I was going to wait a little bit, but we'll go right there. An article that came out just a day ago under Business Insider, it has an article about Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy with government spending cuts for veterans and NASA. So let's talk a little bit about that. This particular article mentions that Ramaswamy's proposal to significantly reduce government spending by cutting programs such as veterans benefits and NASA spending. What are your thoughts on the feasibility and potential repercussions of such sweeping cuts in these type of programs?
Well, first, it's very unclear as to what the scope is going to be. All right. Frankly, the last thing we need is a new government department. We got too many already. Secondly, it's not in the government. And thirdly, it's being run by two people rather than one person. All right. It appears as if it's going to be the following. And I have met with some of the transition people for the DOGE and gave them some input. I expect I'm going to continue to be interacting with them in some way in the future. The way I look at it right now, it is an external entity outside of government. It is a modern day Grace Commission. Remember, the Grace Commission was created by President Reagan during his presidency, brought in tapped a bunch of people from the private sector to try to help economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Okay. So an expanded, an expedited, on steroids Grace Commission. From my standpoint, they're primarily going to be looking at the organization and operations of government. How can you improve economy, efficiency, and hopefully effectiveness? It's only got a limited life. It's supposed to be done by July 4th, 2026, which is our 250th birthday as a nation, at least the Declaration of Independence. And, it's still not clear how it's going to be staffed. It's also clear that they're going to probably, all they can do is make recommendations. Have any authority other than to make recommendations. Those recommendations will probably get filtered through the department, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. And then they'll have to be segmented between what can be done through executive order, what requires legislation, and in some cases, what requires a constitutional amendment. But what you don't want to do is to, let's say we're going to cut government X% across the board. That's mindless. There are parts of government that are needed and that are effective. One example of that is the GAO, where we generate a huge rate of return. There are other parts of government that don't meet those criteria. And so I think what we need to do is not just look at transactional change, but transformational change.
Sustained.
So that can be sustained over time. And so I think they're going to do some things in the next year and a half that will help, but we're going to need more than that. And if you go to my website, which is american2040.com, and if you look under the articles and videos section, you'll find my latest op-ed, which says, we need DOGE, but DOGE is not enough. DOGE is kind of phase one on what we need to do to get on the right path, but there are other phases that need to follow on from DOGE.
Okay. So since we're here, the recent creation, supposedly, quote unquote, creation of the Doge department under Elon Musk's leadership, co-leadership with Ramaswamy, has sparked discussions about efficiency and cost savings in the federal government. With your extensive experience in government transformation, how do you view the role of private sector leaders in reshaping public institutions, especially these two gentlemen who have not worked in the public sector like yourself? How do you think they're going to reshape public institution? And do you think that they can bring lasting reform?
Well, I think obviously they have some valuable experience, in particular, Elon Musk does, but there's a big difference between the private sector and the public sector. For example, Elon bought X, well, formerly Twitter.
Yep.
And he downsized it 70 to 80%. All right. Well, that's not too difficult for him to do because he owned and controlled it. There weren't unions, and therefore it was easier to do. In the government, the most heavily unionized sector of the economy is the government. Okay. In addition, there's a lot more protection for civil servants. All right. In addition, there are a number of things that can't be done by the chief executive. They require legislation in order to be able to do it. So I think one of the things that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy is going to need, they're going to need some people who actually have some direct experience in government doing government transformation. All right. It's very difficult. It's a lot more difficult in the government than it is the private sector. Candidly, I'm the only person that I know who's actually downsized and transformed the government agency in the last 25 plus years.
There you go.
Yeah, and so we'll see what happens. But yes, they have some ideas about what works in the private sector that could be applied here, in particular technology. How can we modernize our technology? How can we employ AI with regard to a lot of things the government's doing? And so they have an outsider's view. They're not encumbered by the status quo. All right. They're more willing to take risk. I mean, one of the challenges that you have in government is it tends to be very risk averse. It tends to be very process oriented, activity oriented rather than outcome oriented. So I think there is an opportunity for them to make a difference, but I also think that they're going to have a lot more understanding of what's possible and what's not possible in government. And it's not just what you want to do, how you're going to get it done. All right.
So
there's a difference between strategy and implementation.
Absolutely.
Strategy is the easy part. The implementation is the difference between success and failure.
Execution. Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about that. In this particular article, Elon Musk emphasized exposing the insanely dumb spending of tax dollars as part of his new role. What areas of government spending do you think are most in need of these type of reforms, and what steps can be taken to ensure greater fiscal accountability without undermining, again, the essential public services that many people are dependent on?
Well, first, I think you have to look to the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, which I for almost 10 years. They have a high risk list. Every time those are areas of the government that are higher risk of fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement are not achieving their mission, gets updated every 2 years. The new list will come out in January or February of 2025. Every new Congress, it comes out. So that's something they can look at. Secondly, they do a transition series. Every time there's a change in administration, it's on their website, which is www.gao.gov. Each major agency, where do they think the agency stands? What are the major outstanding recommendations they have? They do work on duplication, overlap, and redundancy and issue an annual report on that. They work along with the inspector generals on improper payments, which is an area to take a look at. So the first thing you want to do is look at what's already there, okay? And try to be able to capitalize on that information. And then you look at, well, where are the areas that tend to have more problems? I mean, contracting has problems, healthcare has problems. There are a lot of programs that were put in place during COVID where there's a huge amount of fraud, waste, and abuse. I would imagine we probably at least $1 trillion for all the programs associated with COVID, and many of which should be terminated immediately. COVID's over. And yet we still got a lot of money that we haven't spent yet. But again, I come back to what I said before. What are we trying to accomplish? How do we measure success on an outcome basis in separating the wheat from the chaff between which ones are actually making progress on things that the people care about and the government ought to be focused on? And they're not going to be able to get that done in 18 months. Okay. They can get a lot done in 18 months, but in my view, they're probably going to have some more recommendations of follow-on work that needs to be done, either by OMB or through a statutory commission where you can force an up or down vote on things like what has happened in the Defense Department before with regard to base closures. When you have something that's very tough, you till the ground, you set the table, and you force an up or down vote. And I think we're going to have to take that approach, on some areas that we're going to have to be able to address in order to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability.
All right. So given your leadership at the U.S. GAO, Government Accountability Office, how important is public trust in government reform efforts? How can leaders like Musk and Ramaswamy with no prior government experience help or hurt efforts to restore the credibility and the transparency within the federal government?
It's critically important. Trust
Okay.
in government right now is at or near an all-time low.
Low. Sure.
Right? And that's not just with regard to government institutions. It's also with regard to Congress. It's also with regard to the media, I might add. So whenever you're making transformational change, there's one word that is critical, 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 and that word is communication. And I think there's work that needs to be done here. I still think there's a lot of confusion about what the scope of the DOGE is.
Okay.
Who's going to be involved? How are they going to go about doing their work? All right. You've mentioned some things that have been talked about. Reductions in force have been talked about. Term limits, which I think we need, but it has nothing to do with what you would think the DOGE would be involved with. So I think one of the first things they need to do is really define what the scope of this effort is. All right. And then make sure that it is staffed appropriately and make sure that there is an appropriate and ongoing communication process about what they're doing, what they're finding. That's going to be critical. If they don't do that, then I think they're going to undercut their own credibility.
Okay.
And effectiveness.
Understood. Another article, it's an opinion that came out recently regarding Project 2025.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about that. In this particular article, it discusses Project 2025's goal of dramatically reducing the size and influence of the federal government, which sounds like you're in that sphere. And in your view, what are the potential economic and sociological impact and consequences of such a shift from big government into shrinking into a much smaller, limited government size?
Well, first, the engine of growth and innovation in our economy is not the government.
Okay.
It's the private sector. Okay. And it's not just big business, it's small business. As I said before, in my opinion, the federal government is grown too big, promised too much, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And it's strayed far from what the founders intended for it to do.
Okay.
I mean, if you look at the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, it talks about provide for the common defense. Well, that's something the federal government needs to do. It can't be delegated to the private sector, although you have contractors that are helping to provide tools and capabilities to do that. But the government has to assume that responsibility. Ensure domestic tranquility. That is a affirmative responsibility of the government, although that is shared between federal, state, and local government. Okay. And then it says to promote the general welfare. Well, promote doesn't mean provide. Promote means encourage. And yet, if you look at a lot of the things the federal government's doing, it is providing.
Fair enough.
And so I think, that we've got to get back and focus on what should the government do, what level of government should do it. Is it necessary for the government to do it, or can the private sector do it better? Can the not-for-profit sector do it better? Where there are opportunities for public-private partnerships, okay? because clearly they can add a lot of value and they take place already right now in many regards. But we also have to be careful not just to measure progress by how many federal employees you have, because in many cases you might eliminate federal employees, but you end up by hiring contractors to do the same thing. So when you're thinking about the impact of government, you have to think about the total force, which is not just federal workers, but also people who are contractors doing federal work. You have to think about how much of the economy does the federal government represent? How much spending is the federal government as compared to GDP? That's where it's really grown dramatically. So I think there are opportunities to reduce the relative size of the federal government, to devolve things more to lower levels of government, to get the private sector and not-for-profit sector more engaged in some of the things that otherwise government's doing, to streamline and simplify government, to deregulate in ways that still provide for essential protections, but we've got way too much regulation. Our tax code is way too complicated. So I think there are real opportunities, but these are not things that are going to happen overnight. Okay. I mean, even when I transformed GAO, we got started quickly, but it was a several-year effort to make the transformation happen and then to put in the mechanisms that would make it stick. And I'm pleased to say that my successor, Gene Dodaro, Comptroller General, who was my number two, he succeeded me. I don't think that'll ever happen again, but it did, and I'm glad it did. I met with him recently and I asked him, Gene, what percentage of the transformational changes that we made when I was there and he was with me, do you think are still in place? And his answer was 95%. That's the key. The key is, to what extent do the changes stand the test of time after the person or persons who led the effort to put them in has long gone?
So let's talk about that. Let's stick with Project 2025, which includes plans to reshape the federal workforce and management structure. Based on your expertise, what lessons can we learn from past attempts to reform government bureaucracy? And furthermore, how do proposals like those in Project 2025 balance or fail to balance fiscal responsibility with broader political goals? And what should the priorities be for responsible governance? I know it's a big, long-winded question, but want to give you a broad scope to to talk to us about this.
Well, first, I'm not an expert on Project 2025.
Okay.
I was not involved in Project 2025. As you recall, President-elect Trump said that he was not involved with Project 2025 and is not that familiar with it and doesn't agree with a number of things in Project 2025. I'm sure he probably agrees with some. There's no doubt about it. But I do know this,
Okay.
that Project 2025 is controversial. I do know that President Trump's nominee for director of OMB was a leading architect of Project 25. I also know that one of the particularly controversial aspects of Project 2025 was this concept of Schedule F, which basically is converting a lot of career civil servants with protections into at-will employment. They could be fired at will, which is extremely controversial. And so as a result of that, I think that the OMB director nominee may have some challenges getting confirmed. He's already been director once. He was director for about the last year and a half, 2 years of Trump's first term. So he's clearly qualified for the job. But the question is, will he be able to get reconfirmed given the subsequent events and given the controversies associated with some of the things that he's directly involved with? We'll see. First, you got to start at where has it worked? In what part of government has this worked? There's not many places. I know, for example, when I was in government, the IBM Center for Government Excellence in Government tried to look for people who had led transformational change in government. And the three that I remember them coming up with were James Lee Witt, who had been head of FEMA during Clinton, Charles Rosati, who was head of the IRS during Bush, and myself. Those were the only three that they really came up with. Okay, and this was issued in the early 2000s, and I don't know of any major transformational changes since then.
Okay.
So
all right.
You would hope that there would be a lot more, but there's not.
Okay.
And there's got to be a reason for that, right? And one of the reasons for that is most of the people who come into government don't come in to make tough transformational changes.
Mm.
They come in to do sexy policy stuff, right?
Okay.
I mean, changing a culture and changing what government does and how it does business is very tough work.
Absolutely.
And plus, a lot of the people who come into government don't have any background in that. Especially people who are coming from political positions. They don't have any background in that at all, right? Those are obstacles. And the fact that many people who come into government, they don't stay very long. The typical tenure for a secretary or deputy secretary in government is about 2 years. First 6 months, you're trying to figure out what to do. Last 6 months, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do next. So you basically got a year of high productivity. Well, that's not enough to make transformational change happen, right?
Not on a big ship like the U.S. government.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
It takes a lot to turn that ship, and that ship is taking on water right now. So, we need to expedite the process.
Okay. So let's talk about you, focus on you now. You served on numerous boards, including as the chair of the United Nations Independent Audit Advisory Committee. What global lessons can the U.S. learn from other countries in terms of fiscal management and government accountability?
Well, in 2010, I partnered with Stanford University's master's program, and we developed a methodology for evaluating and ranking countries based upon fiscal responsibility and sustainability. Okay. So it was both where you are, what path you're on, and then what mechanisms do you have to try to provide reasonable assurance that you will take a prudent path in the future.
Okay.
The U.S. was number 28.
Wow.
In the world.
Who was number one, if you recall?
At that time, Australia.
Okay.
We wouldn't be number 28 today. We'd be lower. We're going the wrong way. There's a tendency for people to think, since the United States is the major superpower on earth, with global economic, diplomatic power, military capabilities, and cultural influence, that we must be ranked highly in just about everything. That's false. We're rated highly in a number of things. We're rated below average in a lot of things. We're below average in K through 12 education. We're below average in healthcare outcomes. I could go on, but the bottom line is we're below average. And those are really important to our future, I might add. And so I've always been a believer that you have to know three things to know how you're doing. How are you doing compared to plan? Are you getting better or worse? And then how do you compare to your comparator or competitor groups? If you don't know all three of those, you don't know how you're doing. And the United States doesn't know all three of those in many cases, all right? And that's when I come back to what I said before. You need to have a plan. You need to have key national outcome-based indicators. They need to cover all those dimensions. And that you need to be able to say, how are you doing on plan? Are you getting better or worse? And how do you compare to your comparators or competitor groups? Then we'll be in a position to make real transformational change in a way that is sustainable over time.
All right.
That's what we have to do.
So your latest book, America in 2040, still in superpower, or correction, still a superpower? Question mark. Takes a deep look at the future of the United States. What do you foresee as the biggest fiscal challenges America will face in the upcoming decades, and how can we best prepare for them?
Well, first, every major fiscal and monetary agency in the United States has said that we're on an imprudent and unsustainable fiscal path.
Absolutely.
The fastest growing expense the federal government has is interest. And what do you get for interest? Our total debt to GDP is at a record high and going up. All right. We now spend more on interest than defense. We now spend more on interest than Medicare. Within the next 5 years or so, we're going to be spending more on interest than anything else. And you get nothing for it if we don't change course. All right. So we're on a burning platform. We cannot continue. We must make tough choices. The other thing you have to keep in mind is learn lessons from history. The leading indicator on the way up as a nation and the leading indicator on the way down is economic power. If you can't put your finances in order, you will not maintain economic power over time. If you don't maintain economic power, your diplomatic influence will go down, your military capabilities will erode, and the desire of people to emulate you from a cultural standpoint will go down as well.
So,
So,
yes, go
so
ahead.
bottom line is it's all about economics, and you got to put the finances together. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bill Owens, both friends of mine, agree with me. The largest threat to our future is not some external nation or non-state actor. It's our own fiscal irresponsibility.
Irresponsibility
is our greatest threat to the future, and we need to start doing something about it soon.
So you've been a part of the movement advocating for fiscal responsibility for years, in fact, decades. What's your message to young leaders and future policymakers who are looking to make meaningful impact on the financial health of our nation?
We are mortgaging the future of our country, our families, and future generations at record rates. That is irresponsible. It is unethical. It is immoral. It must stop. We have to recognize the reality that when this country was founded, one of the key concepts that we've lost our way on is stewardship. And by that, I mean, as a leader, your responsibility is not just to generate positive results today, not just to leave things better off when you leave than when you came, but better positioned for the future. And for young people, there's a lot of young people that are concerned about environmental issues. And it's true that climate change is real, and mankind, in order to solve that problem, it has to be a global effort. If every major country does not participate in the effort, you cannot succeed. And on the other hand, with regard to our nation's finances, the only people that can solve that problem is us. And so young people need to be much more engaged in trying to force change on the fiscal front, because they're going to pay the price. They're going to bear the burden if their elected leaders don't act. And, the last president we had that was fiscally responsible was Bill Clinton.
Yes.
And we need another one ASAP.
All right. So three big expenses of the federal government is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the Department of Defense. Those are all big, big, big budget items. Let's have a little bit of a closing thoughts, because we're getting close to the end of time here. What are your personal actions and steps that you and your wife, Mary, are taking for your retirement plan? Are you doing anything to help supplement your Social Security benefits as well, and also your Medicare benefits?
Well, first, I believe in practicing what I preach and leading by example. The federal government, as I said before, has grown too big, promised too much, is going to have to restructure. It's going to do less with regard to social insurance, although, how you go about that is important to maintain the social safety net, if you will. It's going to tax more. All right.
Okay.
We've been told our whole life that you're going to pay a lower effective income tax rate when you're retired. That's not going to be the case if we don't end up making major changes soon. And so therefore, what I've done is I've taken a number of steps to make sure that my wife and I have adequate guaranteed income throughout our entire life, which Social Security is just a real small piece of that. I have 3 life annuities, which is fully indexed to inflation. You can't buy that anymore. One of which is indexed 3% a year, which should be adequate to cover inflation. And
there's other private pension funds that have other types of guarantee, but yes, you have a great one.
And then I have one that's not indexed. Between full and part-time employment, I've spent at least 25 years in government. I do not get a dime of pension benefits from the federal government. I do not get a dime of retiree healthcare benefits from the federal government. On the other hand, I've taken steps to make sure that I'm adequately covered. We have 0 debt. And then I have other assets that can be used for enjoying life, for legacy purposes, whether it be with regard to our kids or with regard to charities that we care about. In doing my planning, I don't just think about the amount of income and how best to invest. I also think about tax strategies, because as I said, tax rates are going to go up over time. They're never going to be lower, in my opinion, than they are right now. And it's just math, right? The biggest thing we need to do is need to get control of spending, but we're not going to be able to get to the promised land unless we end up generating more revenues as a percentage of GDP as well. You can get some of that through pro-growth policies. You're not going to get all of it through pro-growth policies. As I said, I have implemented strategies for myself, some of which may make sense for others, some of which may not, which includes Roth conversions, which includes donor trust, which includes a variety of different things. And I think what's important is for people to get informed with regard to what the nature of our finances are, encourage their elected representatives to make tough choices sooner rather than later, and work with independent qualified advisors to help them determine what can they do to protect their families and themselves against this. Excuse me.
Yes, working with an independent financial advisor that looks at tax strategies that can set up private pension funds to be able to have that retirement income that you cannot outlive, critical. That is part of the huge supplement for Social Security benefits. And of course, long-term care, another big one. These are all things that it's very difficult for you if you're an independent person that likes to be independent, self-doer, don't trust anybody. But when it comes to these types of planning, tax efficiency, tax mitigation, setting up private pension funds and utilizing these donor funds and whatnot for tax efficiency, these are things that most people that are self-doers are not able to do themselves. So do speak with a licensed wealth advisor to help you with that. With that in mind, last question. Elon Musk had talked about participating in the Doge program or the department that he's going to be leading. He's looking for people that is willing to work 80 hours. And I believe the last thing that I heard is work complimentary, or in other words, for free. If he came to ask you to do that, what would you say to him?
Well, first, he wants above average IQ, which I think I have based on testing. Number two, he wants you to work 80 hours a week for a year and a half for nothing. Look, I think I can make a major contribution to his effort.
Okay.
But I'm not willing to work 80 hours a week for a year and a half for nothing.
For nothing. Okay.
Nothing.
80 hours with pay, or 80 hours, or I should say lower hours, but with pay or without pay.
I don't want to negotiate on a podcast.
Got it. Okay. Fair enough.
Elon needs to give me a call.
We appreciate that. We absolutely appreciate that. Any final thoughts or final words?
We live in a great country. It's not as great as we think we are.
Okay.
We've got a lot of red lights going off that we need to come to grips with, including the need to put our finances in order. We need to do it sooner rather than later. People need to become informed and involved and put pressure on their elected officials to do so. But they also need to take steps to be able to help themselves, their families, by understanding what the likely implications of this are and what they can and should do to try to help create a better future within things that they can control. If you want to know more about this, go to American2040.com. It's good to be with you, David. Thanks for the opportunity.
We thank you so much for joining us today. I am sure that our viewers and listeners are going to take all of this to heart. Thank you for tuning into this episode's Jet Setting Wealth Advisory Podcast. A big thank you for the Honorable David M. Walker for joining us and sharing his incredible insight into fiscal responsibility, financial planning, and wealth management. If you'd like to learn more about David's work or explore his resources, please be sure to check the links in the show notes. I'm David Yu, airline pilot, founder, and wealth advisor at DTY Wealth Planning Solutions. Don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with anyone aimed to take their financial journey to the next level. Until next time, remember to stay on the course, think strategically, and keep building your wealth and confidence with a purpose. Thank you and goodbye.
49 faces looked to him in triumph. Over the last 12 months, they had each taken turns and promoted his business for a week at a time, driving over $987,342 in revenue. What if you had a network of 50 centers of influence who promoted your business every week for a year? Grab your copy of the #1 Amazon best-selling book, The Ultimate Guide to Growing Your Business with a Podcast, at 33% off the Amazon price by going to ultimatepodcastbook.com. Again, that website for 33% off the Amazon price is ultimatepodcastbook.com.